Hello and welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. We have some unfortunate news, as YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep the lights on. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our incredible staff for their living expenses and continue bringing you these adventures. You can easily support the channel by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the donation link down in the video description or the pinned comment. They say the orbital scrapyard of Omega-7 is where the galaxy's garbage goes to die, reduced to atoms in the roaring belly of a plasma furnace. Felipe Burks thought he was just buying another hunk of worthless slag to keep his creditors from breaking his kneecaps. He had no idea he was bidding on a cosmic mystery, or that his biometric signature was about to chain his soul to a darkness older than the stars themselves. Rain did not fall on the outer belt of Station Omega-7. Instead, a constant drizzle of synthetic coolant and leaking hydraulic fluid wept from the overhead gantries, coating everything in a slick, iridescent sheen of misery. Felipe Burks trudged through the muck, his heavy magnetic boots clanking against the rusted grating of the yard. He was a spaceship scrapper by trade, but lately, he was little more than a professional debtor. He owed 75,000 credits to the kind of underground syndicates who did not send polite reminder letters. They sent enforcers with neural whips. Felipe was here for the scraps of the scraps. He hoped to scavenge a few functioning ion relays or perhaps a depleted energy core that he could refurbish and pawn for enough ration packs to survive another week. The auction block was a grim, mechanical spectacle. A massive conveyor belt groaned under the weight of pulverized dreadnoughts and gutted commercial freighters, carrying the galaxy's forgotten refuse straight into the blinding, white-hot maw of the central plasma furnace. The heat radiating from the incinerator made the oily air shimmer and dance. The automated announcer crackled over the public address system. Lot 7749 approaching the primary incinerator. Felipe barely looked up from his empty digital wallet. The item moving along the heavy belt was nothing but a colossal, misshapen lump of carbonized slag. It looked like a massive tumor excised from the hull of a deep space mining rig. It was ugly, deeply scarred, and entirely devoid of any salvageable titanium, copper, or platinum. It had no physical value whatsoever. It was destined for the fire, and nobody in their right mind would waste a single credit to stop it. Then, the slag mass drifted past Felipe's position on the viewing gantry. A sudden, jarring sensation washed over him. It was not a physical force pushing against his chest or tugging at his heavy canvas jacket. Instead, it was an impossible, sickening pull on his very silhouette. The overhead arc lamps cast harsh, downward illumination, meaning his shadow should have been a tight, dark puddle around his boots. But as Felipe looked down, his breath caught in his throat. His shadow was stretching. It elongated across the grime-coated deck plates, pointing straight toward the passing chunk of slag, completely defying the direction of the overhead light source. It was as if the darkness attached to his heels was desperately trying to reunite with something buried deep inside that ugly rock. A cold sweat broke out beneath the collar of his grease-stained jumpsuit. An intense, profoundly irrational intuition seized his mind. Every survival instinct he had honed over 30 years of scraping by on the edge of the galaxy screamed at him to walk away. Yet, his arm moved of its own accord. Just as the automated system began counting down the final 3 seconds before the lot was dumped into the plasma inferno, Felipe thrust his digital bidding paddle high into the air. He locked in the absolute floor price of 50 credits. The floor boss, a hulking cyborg with a rusted jawplate and a pneumatic arm, paused the conveyor and glared at Felipe with a singular synthetic eye. "You bid on the rock, Burks?" the boss grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble that echoed over the hum of the furnace. "You have gone completely insane. Sold to the dead man walking." The transaction was logged. The automated crane violently diverted the heavy slag off the belt and dropped it onto Felipe's rented loading dock with an earth-shaking thud. Felipe approached his new purchase, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp on his tongue. The surface of the slag was cold, unnaturally so, absorbing the ambient heat of the yard rather than reflecting it. He climbed onto the uneven exterior, shining his handheld inspection torch into a deep fissure near the top. What he saw made his mind reel. The beam of light did not illuminate a shallow crack of solid rock. Instead, the light fractured and bent. Through the fissure, Felipe looked into an impossible interior. The spatial geometry inside the rock did not align with its external dimensions. He saw sheer drops, angles that folded back in on themselves in ways that made his eyes throb with pain, and a hazy, seemingly endless corridor illuminated by a pale, flickering bioluminescence that had no visible power source. It was a cavernous expanse trapped inside a rock no larger than a standard cargo transport. "Hey, Burks!" a yard attendant yelled from below, holding up a glowing data tablet. "You need to finalize the transfer before we charge you hourly holding fees. Press your palm on the pad." Felipe scrambled down from the rock, his mind buzzing with a terrifying mix of awe and dread. He wiped his greasy hand on his trousers and pressed his palm flat against the biometric scanner of the datapad. A sharp electronic beep confirmed the transfer of ownership. In that exact fraction of a second, a terrifyingly cold electrical current shot directly up Felipe's arm and plunged into his spine. It felt like a frozen needle piercing his central nervous system, mapping his DNA in an instant. He snatched his hand back, gasping for air and stumbling backward. The datapad flashed green, displaying the word approved. Felipe Burks stood shivering under the flickering neon glow of the scrapyard, entirely unaware of what he had just done. He thought his biometric signature had just transferred the deed to a pile of junk. He did not know that he had just signed a biological contract, binding himself at a cosmic level to an entity the universe had tried very hard to bury. According to the ruthless bylaws of the Omega-7 Orbital Authority, a buyer had exactly 72 hours to dismantle and remove their purchased salvage from the temporary holding docks. If a single scrap remained after that window closed, the yard enforcers would forcefully clear the bay, toss the junk into the incinerator, and fine the owner a catastrophic sum. Felipe had no time to waste staring at impossible geometries. He needed to cut this rock open, find something valuable, and sell it before his creditors found him. He hauled his heavy industrial laser cutter out of his toolbox, connecting the thick, braided power cable to a portable fusion generator. The cutter was a brute force instrument, designed to slice through battle-grade titanium plating by generating a concentrated beam, burning at nearly 4,000 degrees. Felipe adjusted his welding goggles, braced his boots against the deck, and squeezed the heavy trigger. A blinding, pure blue lance of coherent light erupted from the nozzle, striking the scarred surface of the slag. Nothing happened. There was no shower of molten sparks, no deafening hiss of vaporized rock, and absolutely no heat radiating back at him. Felipe pushed the beam harder, stepping closer, but his eyes widened in sheer disbelief behind his dark lenses. The laser was not bouncing off the surface. It was passing straight through it. He deactivated the cutter, his hands trembling. The surface of the rock was entirely unmarked. It was ice cold. Felipe was a veteran scrapper. He knew every alloy and composite in the galaxy. But this defied the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. He realized, with a creeping sense of scientific dread, that the material was not resisting the laser. It simply did not exist in the exact same microsecond as the beam. The outer shell was vibrating at an entirely different temporal frequency, rendering it completely immune to physical interaction in the present tense. Suddenly, the harsh overhead halogens in the dock began to flicker, their electrical hum dropping to a low, agonizing drone. The ambient temperature plummeted. Felipe felt his breath turning into white vapor in the air. He turned around, instinctively reaching for a heavy wrench, but stopped dead in his tracks. The single, harsh spotlight, casting his shadow against the corrugated steel wall of the dock, was acting strange. The light was steady, but his shadow was not. Felipe stood perfectly still, his arms pinned to his sides in terror. But the dark silhouette on the wall slowly raised its right hand. It was a suffocating, mind-bending violation of reality. He tried to speak, to yell for the yard attendant, but his throat locked up. The shadow on the wall did not belong to him anymore. It was being puppeteered by an unseen, formless intelligence that had just woken up from an eon of dead sleep. The silhouette extended a long, disproportionate finger and pointed directly at Felipe's hip. It was pointing at his heavy-duty diagnostic scanner, the small device strapped to his utility belt. Swallowing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, Felipe unclipped the scanner. The device, meant for reading radiation levels and structural integrity, was malfunctioning violently. The standard blue interface was gone. Instead, the small screen was flooding with a deep, pulsing, blood-red light. The screen scrambled, pixels dying and reviving in rapid succession, until sharp, angular letters carved themselves into the display. The red text read, "System initialized. Welcome, Warden." Felipe stared at the glowing words, his mind racing to comprehend. More text began to scroll rapidly across the tiny screen, writing and rewriting itself faster than any standard processing unit could render. The intelligence did not have a voice to echo in the cavernous dock, but its words screamed in his mind. It identified itself as the Kronos Caravel. It explicitly clarified that it was not a spacecraft built for traversing physical distance. It possessed no faster-than-light engines, no ion thrusters, and no conventional navigation systems. It moved by folding the fabric of the timeline itself, a mythological engineering concept that theoretical physicists considered a fairy tale of civilizations that had gone extinct millions of years before humanity ever looked up at the stars. Felipe felt a brief surge of unimaginable wealth. If he held the keys to a machine that could manipulate time, his debts were entirely meaningless. He could own the galaxy. But the red text on the scanner did not stop. The narrative it violently printed onto the screen shifted from a mechanical status report to a dire, apocalyptic warning. The Kronos Caravel was never built to be a vehicle of exploration, nor was it a technological gift left behind for future generations to inherit. The breathtaking internal geometries Felipe had witnessed were not crew quarters or engine rooms. The entire structure was a labyrinthine puzzle box, a perfect, inescapable cage. The ship was a maximum security penitentiary designed to hold a single, catastrophic prisoner. The screen flashed the words "temporal parasite" in a blinding crimson hue. The text explained that this entity was a cosmic anomaly, a predator that did not consume physical matter, but fed exclusively on the future. It survived by latching onto the temporal trajectories of living stars and entire star systems, eating their probability and collapsing their timelines into dead, hollow voids. The ancient architects who built the Caravel possessed unimaginable power, yet they found that the parasite could not be killed. It could only be contained. They sealed it inside the folded time of the Caravel, wrapping the entire vessel in a dense camouflage of temporal slag to hide it from the universe forever. The cold truth slammed into Felipe like a physical blow. When he had pressed his palm to the biometric pad, he had not purchased a derelict ship. The system had recognized a sentient biological signature, accepting ownership of the coordinates. He had legally, at a cosmic level, assumed the mantle of the Warden. He was now the sole guardian of the most dangerous entity in the known universe. The screen blinked rapidly, the red light casting harsh shadows across Felipe's terrified face. The final message printed itself with terrifying clarity. Warning: temporal anchor Shell is currently in proximity to a Class 9 plasma furnace. If the camouflage shell is subjected to extreme gravitational or thermal destruction, the fold will collapse. The parasite will be released. It will consume the timeline of this galaxy within 48 standard hours. Do not let them burn this vessel. Felipe looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto the colossal, roaring plasma incinerator at the center of the yard. The Omega-7 Authority was ruthless. In exactly 71 hours, they were going to drag this rock straight into the fire. And in doing so, they would erase the future of the entire galaxy. Felipe did not call the sector authorities. The authorities were bureaucrats, completely incapable of handling a galactic extinction event. Instead, he routed an encrypted, untraceable communication link to the lowest levels of a nearby penal colony. He needed the only person in the quadrant crazy enough to believe him. "Vance," Felipe said the moment the static cleared, "I need you at Omega-7. Now, drop whatever illegal fusion still you are building and get here." Doctor. Alara Vance had once been the leading theoretical physicist at the Galactic Academy, right up until the board revoked her license for publishing unhinged papers on time compression mechanics. Now, she survived by fixing black market warp drives in the slums. "Felipe, if this is about that 65 credit loan, you can go walk out an airlock." Alara's voice cracked over the speaker. "I found a chronal fold," Felipe shot back, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I am standing in front of a structure that exists outside of our thermodynamic reality. It is vibrating, and it just spoke to me." There was a heavy pause on the line. "Give me 20 minutes." Alara arrived looking like a ghost in a grease-stained trench coat, carrying a bulky, haphazardly wired quantum scanner that hummed with illegal amounts of radiation. She bypassed the yard security with a stolen access code and sprinted onto Felipe's dock. She did not bother saying hello. She just aimed her scanner at the massive, ugly rock and booted the primary sequence. The scanner shrieked. It was a high, piercing wail that made Felipe cover his ears. Alara dropped the device to the deck, her eyes wide, reflecting the erratic green flashes of the overload warning. "You absolute idiot!" Alara breathed, stepping closer to the rock. "You did not buy salvage. You bought a myth." "The screen told me it was a prison," Felipe said, pacing nervously. "It said there is a parasite inside that eats the future. Tell me you know how to turn it off." "You do not turn off a localized anomaly. Felipe, you calibrate it," she muttered, running her bare hands over the freezing, scarred surface of the slag. "This outer shell is just a degraded kinetic barrier. It was built to keep primitive scanners from seeing the core. But the locking mechanism is biological. Since you signed the deed, your biometric resonance is the key. Give me your hand." She grabbed Felipe by the wrist and slammed his palm against a specific, imperceptible groove in the rock. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The massive chunk of slag shuddered. A deafening crack echoed through the docking bay as the dull, carbonized exterior shattered like an eggshell. Massive chunks of useless rock rained down around them, revealing the true form of the Kronos Caravel. Felipe gasped. It was not built of metal or wire. The ship was a colossal, impossible construct of pure time glass. It was a crystalline leviathan, entirely transparent, yet churning with the trapped light of 10,000 swirling galaxies. Looking at its hull was like looking directly into the deep, infinite past. But the shattering of the shell had a consequence. As the camouflage fell away, the uncontained temporal energy of the ship pulsed outward in a massive, invisible shockwave, rippling across the fabric of the sector. Light years away, in the obsidian towers of the Axiom Syndicate headquarters, alarms began to scream. Axiom was a hyper-capitalist monopoly that controlled exactly 100% of commercial and military space travel in the galaxy. They owned the hyperlanes, the fuel processing, and the warp technology. For decades, they had hunted the myth of the Kronos Caravel. They did not care about the parasite trapped inside. They only cared about the ship's engine. If Axiom could reverse engineer time-folding technology, they would no longer just control space. They would monopolize time itself, cementing their absolute, eternal dominance over the universe. Silas Vane, the chief executive officer of Axiom, stood in his command center, watching the temporal shockwave register on the main tactical display. He was a man with cold, synthetic eyes, and a tailored suit that cost more than a small planetary system. Sir," the tactical officer stammered. "The signal originated from the Omega-7 scrapyard. Sector law dictates a 72-hour grace period for private salvage operations before we can legally intervene." Vane did not even blink. "Burn the law. Dispatch the Blackguard fleet immediately. I want that shipyard locked down, quarantined, and secured. Kill the scrapper. Bring me the ship." Back at Omega-7, the celebration of discovering the time-glass ship was cut brutally short. The space above the scrapyard tore open. It was not a standard warp jump. The sky seemed to bleed as 40 Axiom Syndicate dreadnoughts ripped their way into local space, their massive gravitational shadows plunging the entire scrapyard into darkness. Felipe and Alara barely had time to react before the automated defense grid of the yard was hacked and shut down. Sirens blared across the sector. Drop ships poured from the dreadnoughts, swarming the docking bay like a hive of mechanical wasps. "Get inside!" Alara screamed, grabbing Felipe by the jacket and pulling him toward a glowing fissure in the time-glass hull. They dove into the shimmering core of the Kronos Caravel, just as the docking bay doors were blown off their hinges. Felipe hit the smooth, alien floor of the ship, rolling to his feet and looking back through the transparent hull. The sight turned his blood to ice. Thousands of elite Axiom mercenaries, clad in heavy tactical armor, flooded the gantry. Above them, the heavy plasma cannons of the dreadnoughts were powering up, painting the fragile, glass-like exterior of the ship with dozens of red targeting lasers. The Syndicate had arrived, and they were pointing 1,000 guns directly at the cage of the apocalypse. The deafening screech of the scrapyard public address system cut through the chaos, echoing off the rusted hulls of 1,000 dead ships. Silas Vane did not bother with a secure communication channel. He wanted the entire sector to hear his absolute authority. "Felipe Burks," the chief executive officer's voice boomed, chillingly calm and amplified to a bone-rattling volume. "You are currently trespassing inside proprietary Axiom Syndicate salvage. Step away from the central command console. Deactivate whatever biometric lock you have triggered. If you force my tactical teams to breach that crystalline hull, we will not just kill you. We will repossess your genetic material, liquidate your assets, and sell your remains to pay off your debts. You have exactly 10 seconds to surrender the vessel." Vane was completely oblivious to the apocalyptic truth. He looked at the transparent Leviathan on his tactical monitors and saw only pure, unchecked corporate power, a monopoly waiting to be claimed. He had no concept of the cosmic horror sleeping in the engine room. If his mercenaries fired those heavy plasma cannons and breached the hull, they would shatter the ancient glass, collapse the containment field, and unleash an entity that would devour the future of the entire galaxy before Vane could even sign a requisition form. Inside the bridge, Felipe stood paralyzed on the smooth, glowing deck. He had a rusted wrench in his pocket and a borrowed radiation scanner. Outside the transparent walls, hundreds of heavily armed operatives were planting explosive breaching charges directly onto the temporal glass. He could not fight a private army with his fists, but as he pressed his bare hands flat against the central control pedestal, he realized he did not need to fight them physically. The moment his skin touched the alien interface, his mind exploded with a torrent of raw data. It was not a screen displaying coordinates. It was a direct, overwhelming neural synchronization. As the legally bound warden of the prison, Felipe felt the internal layout of the ship overlay itself onto his own nervous system. He could feel the heavy bulkheads, as if they were his own ribs, the pulsating energy conduits like veins carrying his blood. More importantly, he sensed the exact perimeter of the ship and the precise spatial coordinates of every single hostile mercenary surrounding them on the gantry. "Ilara!" Felipe gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly as he processed the crushing weight of the telemetry. "They are going to blow the main airlock in 5 seconds. I cannot stop the explosion with physical shields. The ship does not have any." "Then use the physics of the ship!" Ilara yelled, frantically swiping her hands across a series of floating holographic glyphs on the co-pilot side of the pedestal. "This is not a traditional boat. Felipe, it is a localized reality engine. Bend the rules of the yard." Felipe did not think. He reacted with pure, desperate instinct. He seized the cognitive reins of the Kronos Caravel and forcefully visualized a perimeter. He drew a mental boundary exactly 100 meters in radius, centering perfectly on the hull of the ship. Instead of trying to build a titanium wall to keep the mercenaries out, he decided to break the fundamental clock they were operating on. Outside, the Axiom Breach commander raised his heavily armored hand, chopped it down fiercely, and screamed the order to detonate. The explosive charges flared with blinding, white-hot light. The heavy shockwave began to ripple toward the fragile glass. And then, reality skipped a terrifying beat. Felipe triggered a localized temporal loop. Inside the 100-meter radius, time snapped backward like a violently overstretched rubber band. The explosion swallowed itself entirely. The blinding light retracted seamlessly back into the charges. The breach commander's arm flew backward in a jerky, unnatural reverse motion, his shouted command slurring backward into silence. Suddenly, the commander chopped his hand down again, screaming the exact same order. The charges flared. The shockwave started. Then, time snapped back again. Felipe watched in stunned, breathless silence through the time-glass hull. The entire elite vanguard of the Axiom Syndicate was trapped in a flawless, inescapable 5-second loop. They planted the bombs. They detonated them. The light flared, and then they were instantly yanked backward by the universe to do it all over again. They were locked in a skipping record of their own violence, completely unable to finish the action. The deafening roar of the explosives became a bizarre, rhythmic, stuttering beat that echoed harmlessly against the hull. Aboard the primary dreadnought hovering above the yard, Silas Vane slammed his fists onto his polished command table. His tactical displays were returning impossible. Paradoxical data. His men were physically there, but their timeline was infinitely repeating. The corporate monopoly he had built on overwhelming firepower was entirely useless against a mechanic who could literally pause reality. "Target the ship with the main orbital batteries," Vane roared, his cold composure finally breaking into pure, unadulterated capitalist rage. "Burn it down! If I cannot have that technology, absolutely no one will." "Felipe, the dreadnought orbital cannons are locking onto our position," Ilara screamed over the ambient, rising hum of the bridge. "That localized loop will not hold against a capital ship strike. We need to move right now." "I do not know how to fly this thing," Felipe shouted back, a thin trail of blood trickling from his nose, due to the sheer mental strain of maintaining the time loop. "It does not fly," Ilara countered fiercely. She abandoned the holographic glyphs and grabbed 2 physical levers protruding from the base of the pedestal. Her mind, perfectly tuned to the forbidden mechanics of time compression, saw the brutal logic in the alien machinery. "It folds space. Hold on to something heavy." Ilara slammed the levers forward with all her strength. She did not ignite a conventional thruster. She activated the chronal drive. The universe outside the glass hull did not blur into long star lines like a standard hyperwarp jump. Instead, the very fabric of space-time folded over the ship like a massive, suffocating dark blanket. The scrapyard, the trapped mercenaries, and the firing orbital cannons compressed into a single, blinding point of light, and then vanished entirely. The Kronos caravel ripped itself violently out of the present tense, diving through a dimensional tear and leaving the Axiom fleet firing superheated plasma into completely empty, worthless space. The violent transition ended with a bone-jarring crash. Felipe and Alara were thrown aggressively to the floor as the ship materialized in a dead, uncharted sector of the cosmos. There were no burning stars here, only a vast, freezing nebula of gray cosmic dust and silent, frozen asteroids drifting in the void. Felipe groaned, pushing himself up from the cold deck. "We made it," he breathed heavily, wiping the blood from his upper lip. "We actually jumped out of the system," but his momentary relief was shattered by a sound that made his soul turn to absolute ice. It was a sharp, distinct crack, echoing loudly from the very center of the ship. Alara froze in place, her eyes locked in horror on the primary containment pillar rising from the middle of the bridge. The violent, completely uncalibrated temporal jump had placed far too much stress on the ancient glass structure. A jagged, glowing fissure had spiderwebbed across the smooth surface of the pillar. From that tiny, glowing crack, a viscous, ink-black mist began to seep out into the cabin. It did not behave like an atmospheric gas. It moved with predatory, calculating intent, twisting and reaching directly toward Felipe. The temporal parasite was leaking from its cage. Before Felipe could even take a single step back to defend himself, a solitary tendril of the black mist brushed against his cheek. There was absolutely no physical pain, but the sensation was unimaginably horrific. He felt a massive chunk of his own personal future violently ripped away from his existence. In a fraction of a single second, his jet-black hair turned stark, dead white at the temples. Deep, exhausted lines carved themselves aggressively into his face. His joints suddenly ached with a heavy, crippling arthritis he had never known. The parasite had just stolen 5 years of his lifespan in a single heartbeat, consuming his biological time to fuel its desperate push against the cracked glass. The dead star system was an ocean of absolute silence, a graveyard of celestial bodies that had burned out billions of years ago. Inside the crystalline bridge of the Kronos caravel, the silence was even heavier, broken only by Felipe's ragged breathing. He stared at his trembling hands. The skin on his knuckles was suddenly thin, mapped with the faint blue veins of a man who had aged 5 years in a single, terrifying second. Alara rushed to his side, her eyes darting from Felipe to the jagged, glowing fissure on the central containment pillar. The ink-black mist of the temporal parasite was slowly retreating back into the crack. But it was not docile. It was testing the structural integrity, pushing against the weakened glass with deliberate, rhythmic pressure. The primary console flared with an intense, crimson light, casting long, bloody shadows across the deck. The ship's system, communicating directly with Felipe's biologically synced mind, unveiled the final, horrifying truth of its existence. The ancient architects had never intended for this prison to drift eternally in the void. No cage lasts forever. The ship was not just a holding cell. It was a delivery mechanism waiting for a pilot. The red text scrolling across the floating holographic display outlined the Terminal Warden Protocol. The creators could not execute the parasite, so they designed a vessel capable of reaching the absolute boundary of the universe, a conceptual coordinate known as the end of time. It was the point of ultimate cosmic heat death, where all matter, energy, and probability ceased to exist. The plan was devastatingly simple. A warden was required to manually pilot the caravel directly into that entropic zero point, effectively detonating the ship and erasing both the parasite and the pilot from the grand tapestry of reality. "They built a suicide machine," Alara whispered, reading the data streams flowing from the console. Her voice was hollow, stripped of all her usual sharp sarcasm. "Felipe, They were just waiting for someone desperate enough to sign the deed. You are not a guard. You are a sacrifice. Felipe leaned against the cold glass of the console, the physical weight of his stolen years pressing down on his shoulders. The cruel irony was suffocating. He had come to the scrapyard to save his own life, to buy a few more weeks of breathing room from his creditors. Now, the universe was handing him an ultimatum of apocalyptic proportions. If they stayed here, the glass would shatter completely. The parasite would pour out, devouring the past, present, and future of every living star in the galaxy. But if he engaged the terminal protocol, he and Alara would be hurled into the abyss of non-existence. To save everything, they had to become nothing. Before Felipe could even process the crushing weight of that decision, the silent void outside the ship began to warp violently. It was not the elegant, seamless fold of the time glass. It was a brutal, jagged tear in the fabric of space. The Axiom Syndicate had not lost their trail. Utilizing aggressive quantum tracing technology, they had tracked the massive temporal wake left by the Kronos Caravel. Dozens of heavily armored capital ships ripped into the dead system, their massive hulls blocking out the faint, distant starlight. But this time, Silas Vane was not taking any chances with time loops or sudden escapes. The lead dreadnoughts launched massive, spear-like projectiles into the vacuum around the Caravel. These were not explosive warheads. They were gravity anchors. The colossal pillars of dark matter slammed into the invisible grid of local space, emitting a pulse of localized, crushing gravity. Felipe felt the deck heave under his boots. The Kronos Caravel groaned in mechanical agony. The anchors had essentially frozen the spatial coordinates, chaining the ship to this exact moment. The chronal drive was completely locked out. They could not full time and they could not jump. They were trapped inside a snare of pure, concentrated mass. The holographic interface on the central pedestal forcibly reconfigured itself. The crimson warnings of the ancient builders were overridden and replaced by the cold, arrogant face of Silas Vane. He was sitting in his command chair, sipping a glass of amber liquid, looking immensely satisfied. "You put up a commendable fight, Burks," Vane said, his voice echoing through the bridge with chilling clarity. "But you cannot outrun Capital. You cannot outrun me. I have locked your coordinates down to the subatomic level. You are not going anywhere." "Vane, listen to me," Felipe shouted, stepping toward the projection. "You have no idea what is inside the core of this ship. If you breach the hull, you will kill us all. You will erase your own future." Vane laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "My future is absolute mechanic. I am going to peel that glass shell off your vessel, extract the engine, and leave you to suffocate in the dark. All batteries. Target the outer hull of the timeship. Fire on my command." Felipe stood completely still. He looked at the face of the billionaire who was perfectly willing to burn the galaxy for a patent. He looked at the jagged crack in the central pillar, where the ink-black, ravenous energy of the temporal parasite was swirling, desperate to feed on a future. Finally, he looked out the viewport at the massive, overwhelming armada of Axiom dreadnoughts surrounding them, packed with thousands of mercenaries and endless arrays of advanced weaponry. A terrifying, absolute silence descended upon Felipe's mind. The desperation evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Vane wanted the ship. The parasite wanted a future to consume. The ancient laws of the Caravel recognized Felipe as the absolute, legal master of the prison. A radically insane, subversive idea sparked in his mind. He did not need to fight the corporate fleet, and he did not need to sacrifice himself to the end of time. He just needed to facilitate a transaction between two monsters. The colossal orbital cannons of the Axiom dreadnoughts began to hum, gathering superheated plasma that glowed with a blinding, apocalyptic intensity. Absolute destruction was merely seconds away. But Felipe Burks did not look at the charging weapons outside the time glass. He completely ignored the holographic projection of Silas Vane gloating over his impending victory. Instead, Felipe walked directly toward the glowing, fractured containment pillar in the center of the bridge, where the temporal parasite furiously thrashed against its failing cage. Felipe placed both of his bare hands flat against the jagged, glowing fissure. He bypassed the mechanical interface entirely and plunged his naked consciousness directly into the dark, churning anomaly. As the legally bound warden of the Kronos Caravel, Felipe possessed absolute administrative authority over the containment protocols of the prison. He decided to use that authority not to reinforce the locks, but to open a direct, telepathic negotiation channel with the cosmic predator. The initial mental contact was agonizing. The parasite was a howling, infinite void of sheer hunger, an entity that perceived reality only as a limitless buffet of potential tomorrows. It immediately tasted Felipe's mind, ready to violently consume his remaining decades. But Felipe pushed back with the unyielding, hardened stubbornness of a man who had spent his entire life haggling for survival in the most unforgiving scrapyards in the galaxy. "Do not touch my timeline." Felipe projected his thoughts into the void with diamond-hard clarity. "If you break out of this shell by brute force, you will run rampant. You will eat the entire galaxy. And then what? The universe will eventually end. You will starve alone in the dark. But I have a much better offer. Consider this a corporate buyout." The howling void in his mind suddenly paused. It possessed a predatory intelligence, ancient and endlessly calculating. "I am the warden," Felipe continued, laying the foundation for the greatest con of his miserable life. "By the ancient, binding laws woven into the very fabric of this ship, I claim sovereign jurisdiction over the immediate spatial coordinates surrounding this penitentiary. Look outside. An entire armada of heavy dreadnoughts has illegally breached my perimeter. They have locked us down with gravity tethers. By the undisputed rules of the old makers, they are aggressive trespassers. They are unregulated salvage. They belong entirely to me." Felipe let the ancient entity sense the sheer, concentrated mass of the Axiom Syndicate fleet hovering just beyond the transparent hull. He showed the parasite the thousands of elite mercenaries, the ruthless commanders, and the cutting-edge hyperdrives pulsating with centuries of potential operational life. "I am selling them to you," Felipe declared, finalizing the unprecedented cosmic contract. "I am trading the complete biological and mechanical future of the entire Axiom fleet. A concentrated, infinite feast of human ambition, corporate greed, and advanced technology. In exchange, you will repair all the structural damage to this vessel. You will release my stolen years, and you will depart this physical plane of existence forever, ascending to a higher dimensional fold where you will never hunger again. Do we have a deal?" Outside the ship, Silas Vane screamed the final order to fire. The massive orbital batteries unleashed torrents of blinding plasma, streaks of absolute, superheated destruction aimed directly at the fragile hull of the Kronos Caravel. But the beams of energy never made contact. Inside Felipe's mind, the parasite felt the intoxicating, overwhelming rush of the offering. It recognized the absolute legal perfection of the warden's trade. The dark anomaly eagerly accepted the terms. The plasma beams violently halted in midair, suspended merely inches from the time glass, as if hitting an impenetrable, invisible wall. Time itself was forcefully paused. And then, the feast began. Silas Vane watched in sheer, uncomprehending horror through his tactical displays. The chronal energy of the parasite completely bypassed the advanced defensive shields of his capital ships. The fleet did not explode. It rapidly decayed. The future of the Axiom Syndicate was violently siphoned away in an instant. In less than 60 seconds, the most advanced, heavily armored warships in the known galaxy began to rot. The pristine titanium armor, plating instantly rusted, turning a sickly, crumbling brown before flaking off into the void. The towering dark matter gravity, anchors that had locked the caravel in place, dissolved into fine, drifting dust. Inside the dreadnoughts, sheer panic erupted, but it was over before a single distress signal could be transmitted. Thousands of heavily armed mercenaries, the ruthless enforcers of absolute corporate greed, aged thousands of years in the span of a single heartbeat. Their tactical armor collapsed. Their bones turned to brittle ash, and their very existence was scrubbed cleanly from the fabric of reality. They were not just killed. They simply ran out of time. Vane fell to his knees on the bridge of his decaying command ship, violently coughing up dust as the glowing screens around him died permanently. The total monopoly he had ruthlessly protected was gone. The absolute power of the Axiom Syndicate had been thoroughly shattered by a mechanic from a filthy scrapyard. Inside the caravel, the terrifying, oppressive aura finally lifted. The ink-black mist of the entity retracted fully into the core. True to the cosmic bargain, the fully satiated parasite poured its remaining energy directly into the fractured pillar. The jagged cracks in the ancient glass seamlessly fused back together, shining brighter and more stable than ever before. With a final, silent pulse of profound gratitude, the temporal parasite unspooled itself from the physical dimension, sliding smoothly through a tear in reality and vanishing into a higher plane. It was gone forever. The ship was entirely pristine, bathed in a warm, steady, and incredibly peaceful bioluminescence. The crushing weight on Felipe's chest evaporated. He looked down at his hands, watching the prominent blue veins fade and the youthful strength return to his skin. His stolen years had been fully refunded. Alara slowly pushed herself off the deck, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief as she looked out the viewport at the swirling clouds of rust and ash that were once an invincible armada. "You sold them," Alara whispered, a massive smile slowly breaking across her face. "You actually auctioned off an entire corporate fleet to a mythological monster." "They were trespassing," Felipe replied, casually dusting off his heavy canvas jacket. He walked over to the central command pedestal, running a hand over the smooth, glowing surface. The neural link was no longer a heavy burden. It felt like a natural extension of his own body. He sat down in the captain's chair, looking out into the vast, open cosmos. He did not owe any underground syndicate 75,000 credits anymore. He did not have to scrounge for scrap metal in the freezing rain of Omega-7 ever again. "So," Alara asked, walking up beside him and leaning against the console, "who are we going to sell this ship to? With this kind of technology, we could buy our own star system." Felipe shook his head, a genuine, completely unburdened smile reaching his eyes for the first time in years. "I am not selling it. The galaxy has far too many people trying to control everything. I think the universe needs a few good mechanics to keep things running properly." Together, the new gatekeepers of time engaged the chronal drive, seamlessly folding space and disappearing into the great unknown, leaving the dusty remains of greedy men far behind them. Thank you so very much for listening to today's story. We truly appreciate your time and would love to know where you are listening from. So please let us know in the comments. As we mentioned earlier, YouTube has completely removed our ability to earn money from these videos, leaving us without any budget to operate. If you found today's adventure entertaining and satisfying, please consider supporting the channel with just $1. Your generous support helps pay our amazing staff so they can provide for their families and keep creating incredible sci-fi stories for you. You can easily help out by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by using the donation link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts, and we will see you in the next story.